This day is brought to you by Progressive. Are you driving your car or doing laundry right now? Podcasts go best when they're bundled with another activity, kind of like Progressive home and auto policies. They're best when bundled too. Having those two policies together makes insurance easier and could help you save. Customers who save by switching their home and car insurance to Progressive save nearly $800 on average. Quote a home and car bundle today at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. National average 12-month savings of $793 by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2021 and May 2022. Potential savings will vary. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, December 1909, 15,000 clothing workers in Philadelphia are preparing to strike. And this is after thousands of garment workers in New York also staged walkouts and protests over conditions at factories in that city. We'll talk about some of those conditions that they were protesting and the specific results of these strikes, but some bigger context is worth highlighting right now because we are talking about strikes in 1909 that did result in improved conditions and did lead to more power for the unions that were organizing these workers. But of course, all of that was overshadowed in many ways by the incident a couple years later at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in New York. That horrific fire that killed almost 150 workers, most of them women, has become one of the defining stories of this era and one that is often seen as spurring a lot of labor activism and reforms. But there was activism before that moment, before the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, and it's a really interesting precursor. So we want to thank our listener Amy, who flagged this for us, gave us the idea to sort of paint this larger context. So let's talk about the garment activism before shirtwaist. Here, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
Amy, perfect listener email, right? A sort of overlooked story that taps into a much bigger theme and recontextualizes something that maybe a lot of people already know, ties into other stories done. Love it. Thank you so much, Amy. Keep writing, folks, if you have ideas. But let's go, I guess, to the specifics of the activism and the conditions on the ground. And there is this interesting New York-Philadelphia dynamic worth pointing out. But let's talk about, say, in New York, we have garment industry, mostly women workers. And in 1909, we do have some real pushback. What are the conditions that people are fighting against?
Well, the proximate conditions for this particular strike is workers in Philadelphia in December of 1909 are realizing there's a ton of new work coming in. And they start to poke around to figure out what's going on, and they find out that they're getting more work because the factory owners in New York City are outsourcing their manufacturing because there's a strike there. So they realize that they're being used as essentially strike breakers at their factories in Philadelphia. And that leads to a spreading of the strikes so that the workers in Philadelphia go on strike as well.
So are you saying that an injustice anywhere is that? No. Okay.
I mean...
I love it.
No, but it is a really interesting dynamic that you have, Philadelphia people activated by this thing that has happened in New York. Kellie, thoughts on the conditions or the striking?
Yeah, the conditions. I mean, the conditions are pretty horrific across the nation. But if you were a typical garment worker during this time, this is completely unregulated work. These are sweatshops. You're working 6 days, sometimes 7 days a week with not a lot of breaks, 14-hour days. And if it's the summer, the heat inside those factories are unbearable. And if you are working in the wintertime, it is freezing cold. There is no protection. You could be a child as young as 10 years old working in these factories. There were no protections. Even the fire escapes were locked off because they thought that workers would steal fabric or perhaps leave the job altogether. And so a lot of these women, because they're majority women who worked in these factories, were locked into these buildings to work for 14-hour days with very few breaks. It's really tough, painstaking work, and not great compensation. And so I think it wasn't very hard for a lot of people to sort of push back and say, hey, listen, we're not doing this. We're not doing this anymore. This is almost not worth it.
I mean, just to add to that, Kellie, because that's already shocking conditions. But these women, who are largely immigrants, many of them are Jewish immigrants, they have to pay for work-related expenses. They have to pay for the light and the heat and the power and the thread. So not only are they being paid a pittance, but they're also on the hook for the cost of doing the work. And so these are kind of maximally exploitive conditions in these factories in the late 19th century and the early 20th century.
And I forgot to mention, I think this is like the sanitation of these factories are not great either. You know, there are very few bathroom breaks and there are very few bathrooms for hundreds of women to use while they're working. The conditions are dire.
And, you know, of course, listeners who are familiar with the shirtwaist story, which we've done episodes on, will recognize a lot of these similar conditions, including that very specific one about the locked doors, which people should go and listen to the episode we did about Triangle Shirtwaist, because we got into that because I just think it's a fascinating one. And there was, you know, it's a little bit unclear why the doors were locked, right? People claim that part of it was to prevent organizing, right? That the place where women would talk to each other about their conditions and find solidarity was in the hallways, right? And so you lock the doors, you can't go out there. I think the more likely answer is that it was simply, we don't want people taking bathroom breaks. We want to keep people in this room. We're going to lock it, and we don't really care. It's an interesting, that specific tidbit just sort of unlocks, so to speak, a lot of the dynamics at play here. But, you know, I think this story here pointing out that there was organizing before Triangle and organizing in these moments maybe indicates that, yes, like I think it was probably in the owner's interest to not create any conditions under which people would start to find solidarity and actually sort of chat with each other and just keep them working.
And yet they find solidarity all the same.
What goes down what goes down in New York, and then how does it trickle down to Philly?
Yeah, so these strikes start in New York at the Lyserson and Company factory and at Triangle. And there have been these like gathering organizing meetings, obviously taking place off-site. And this remarkable young woman, she's a teenager, Claire Limlick. She's already a well-known striker. She, police brutality was a big part of these strikes. And she had taken quite a few police beatings in her young life. And she speaks up at this meeting. She's like, these conditions are intolerable. And I'm tired of people who just kind of complain generally. But what we have to do is we need to make a decision about whether we're going to strike or not. And we need to declare a strike now. And that's the rallying cry for the women at these two factories to go all in on the strike. And you get the first general strike of garment workers in New York thanks to Lemlick's call.
Yeah. I love it. She says, I'm a working girl. Like the idea that these are young women, predominantly young women that are doing hard labor and hard work. And they wanted that protected, and they wanted dignity with their work and fair wages with their work and fair conditions, with that work as well. They weren't, when you think about what they're asking for, this is something that no one would stand for by today's standards. And yet, decency on the job was a huge part of those pushes.
Yeah.
And very specific demands, right? They want consistent pay. They want safe working conditions. They don't want to keep paying for the materials that they use to work with. So they had specific demands. And they also had, even though they faced, of course, significant pushback from the business community, they also had a lot of really powerful backers. This is a period where there are all of these wealthy social reformers, progressives. There are also some established unions like the Women's Trade Union League, the Lady Garment Workers Union. So you have these resources that they can turn to because like 7,000 women are on strike and they need the support of people with money to give them funds to help them out during this period that they're on strike.
You're used to hearing my voice on the world, bringing you interviews from around the globe.
And you hear me reporting environment and climate news. I'm Carolyn Beeler.
And I'm Marco Werman. We're now with you hosting the world together. More global journalism with a fresh new sound.
Listen to The World on your local public radio station and wherever you find your podcasts.
I love about this is that there's a lot of solidarity among other women. You have these wealthy social reformers, but you also have women who are enrolled in colleges, and they're like, hey, you need food? Well, we got you on food. We'll help pay for, like bail money if anybody needs it. Do you need supplies for signs or things of that nature? Like, they are helping as much as they can financially, because it takes finances to even support a strike.
It does move down to Philadelphia, and there is, as we said, the word starts to get out. Why are we seeing so many workers being moved down here? Where are they coming from? What's going on? Garment workers begin to realize what's happening. In December of 1909, this is the moment we're marking, about 7,000 garment workers begin a strike for the same demands as the people in New York. And no surprise, the police are mobilized to break it up. But then, as you said, NIki, local reformers and sort of business leaders and civic leaders start to offer solidarity and support the strike. And they are bringing out food and providing meeting places and bail money and so forth. I'm curious, NIki, in particular, like you did your undergraduate thesis on Upton Sinclair, right? You know this stuff, but like, especially, I don't know, did Upton Sinclair write about Philadelphia? Do you have any thoughts on the Philadelphia-ness specifically about this?
So Sinclair is primarily writing about Chicago, certainly in the jungle he is. But the Philadelphia-ness of this is important. Philadelphia is part of this kind of large string of cities that have these industrial factories that are emerging in the late 19th and early 20th century. And it also has, one of the things Philadelphia has is wealthy progressives. It just has a ton of them, and particularly progressive women who are the backbone of the wealthy community in the city. Not to say there aren't plenty of conservatives as well, but I think it matters that you have those wealthy progressive women who are able to intervene and help keep this strike going. And that kind of solidarity across class lines, it happens in other places too, but Philadelphia in particular is one of those places where the movement and the money meet in ways that are particularly effective.
You even have President Taft's daughter, Helen Taft, who's basically telling these strikers, like, don't give up, persevere. Like, that says something when you have people that have, political weight behind them. And advocating with them.
I am realizing we should do a sort of mini series on outspoken daughters. Outspoken presidential daughters, right?
Alice Roosevelt.
Yeah.
I love that,
including in fiction, right? Including in The West Wing, there's that character as well. But yeah, I think there's
Zoe.
There's some interesting stuff to be done there. All right. Well, do you want to talk about the result here, and then I do want to take that step back and kind of ask how it recasts it. But I mentioned in the intro, not only were these kind of actions that we maybe didn't know about, but there were actual tangible results, despite the kind of obvious tragedies of the coming years.
They win. The strikers get what they want. They get recognition of their union. They get a shorter work week. They get increased wages. They no longer have to pay for needles and thread. This is an enormous victory, and one of those moments that demonstrates union power in the United States in the early 20th century. This is something that unionized workers and workers who want to unionize are going to build off of. And I think it's important that these are women, these are young women who are organizing, because even within the labor movement, there was, let's call it, skepticism about the ability of women to strike, the ability of women to last through the conditions of a strike and police brutality and those kinds of things. And so I think it's a pretty important moment in labor history.
And I can say, before the vote, because women are not voting yet, the strike and the boycott are two of the most powerful tools that I think oppressed and exploited people have, to be able to say, I will withhold my labor, or I will withhold my spending until you do right by the consumer, until you do right by the employee. These are things that terrified big corporations. They hated strikes, they hated boycotts, and wanted to end them as quickly as possible. And so this showed the economic, social, political power that women could use when they didn't have sort of access to the ballot.
Right. So then what do we make of the fact that we have the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire in a couple years where none of these conditions seem to have really changed?
Well, I do think some conditions changed, right? These are now unionized workers. They weren't able to gain the workplace safety changes that they wanted. But I also think it changes in just how we think about that story itself. Because we are told the story of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fires, a story of victims, of women who were in unbearable conditions and who were caught by this fire. And of course, 150 or so die in some really tragic and awful circumstances. But these were also women who were agents, right? They were women who were taking control of their work lives, and no, they weren't able to get everything they wanted. No, they weren't able to prevent this tragedy. But it gives us a fuller picture of the women who work there, and the fact that they weren't just victims. And I think that's really important.
Yeah. And the Shirtwaist Fire is, it's the ultimate cautionary tale. In a lot of ways, like, this is what people feared if changes weren't made. They feared that there would be not just loss of lives, but massive loss of lives. It hurts everyone in the community. These are wives, these are mothers, these are friends, these are people that were providing for their households and people that the community cared very deeply about. And it shows that companies have to respond to that.
And also that unions are a necessary but not a sufficient condition, right? So you have this unionization, you have these demands, you have these new agreements, but it ultimately is going to take the power of the federal government to regulate workplaces. And the government is pushed to regulate workplaces because of unionization. So they work together, but it is a reminder that there needs to be more heft and more power behind these demands. And it makes a real difference when the government gets involved.
Which to me recalls one of my, I just think, most interesting little fascinating historical tidbits, which is that Francis Perkins, who would go on to be a huge proponent of governmental reform, witnessed the Shirtwaist Factory fire firsthand. And, that stuck with her. And I think that lesson that you just laid out, NIki, really landed with her. I think that this story, lets us recast what happened at Shirtwaist as not the start of a conversation, but a kind of another moment in an ongoing conversation, which is usually the way that history works, right? These things are bubbling all the time, and people, and it's two
prologue, context.
2 steps forward, 1 step back, if not the opposite, And so, I think it's just really, really interesting context for that. We again thank our listener Amy for flagging it for us. So let's move on from that story, do a couple also on this days. Here we are in early mid-December, December 12th, also on this day. 1816, Indiana becomes the 19th U.S. state. Good for you, Indiana.
Woo-hoo.
Congratulations, NIki. I'm sure you...
As the resident Hoosier, that date and date have been...
Oh, really? I was going to make a joke about how... But it is a big date growing up.
You have to, because when you learn Indiana history in 4th grade, you got to learn all this
Are there
stuff.
any rituals that we should observe in solidarity?
Just a Pioneer Day. You just stick an ear of corn outside, see how fast it freezes to find out how long winter is going to be.
Throw a chair across a basketball court, on Bobby Knight.
R.I.P. Bobby Knight.
I guess so.
Also on this day in 1952, Jimmy Carter, some 25 years before he becomes president, prevents nuclear disaster at Chalk River.
We did that, right?
We did do that.
We did do that, and we certainly talked about Carter as secret nuclear expert. Not many people knew that.
And in 1975, Sarah Jane Moore admits to trying to kill President Ford.
Her and Squeaky Fromm.
Did we do that?
Lady killers.
Just blurring
I think
together.
we did do Sarah Jane Moore.
2000, the Supreme Court releases its decision on Bush v. Gore. I think we heard, right? Boo. You can kind of hear you can hear in the also on this days, how long it takes to play out, because like 4 episodes ago we mentioned the sort of early court filing in this, and so this is that moment. And then
I was saying booish, so
exactly.
And on this day in 2015, the Paris Climate Change Agreement is adopted.
So there you go. It's funny. I feel like maybe I'm inventing this, but I feel like I see in this between Thanksgiving and Christmas a lot of like summits and prizes and that kind of thing. And it's the kind of like time to get together and come up with grand ideas that then often you don't follow up on.
The Nobel Prize rap list.
Exactly. But we are in that period, I guess, here. All right. Again, we're going to do a lot more of this in coming episodes and in our newsletter. So make sure you go and sign up for that at thisdaypod.com, where you can also find transcripts of the show, and you can also get in touch, and you can also support the show by donating to Radiotopia. We were in the middle of a fundraiser. So go to thisdaypod.com for all your This Day in Esoteric Political History needs. Meanwhile, as always, Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Support for This Day in Esoteric Political History comes from Odoo. What is Odoo? Well, Odoo is the only software your business will ever need. Featuring a suite of integrated business applications, Odoo connects your business operations together so you can get more done in less time. Odoo has apps for everything: CRM, accounting, sales, HR, inventory, marketing, manufacturing, you name it, Odoo's got it. To learn more, visit odoo.com/thisday. That's odoo.com/thisday.
Radiotopia.